If a country can't hold together and all feel that they're on the same team, you can't run a democracy. India has succeeded in uniting across more than 20 languages, caste divisions, religious divisions, geographic divisions. India has succeeded in creating a sense of nationhood.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. In 1942, in the midst of the Second World War, Robert Menzies delivered one of his Forgotten People broadcasts, a lesser-known one, I must say, and it was on the problem of India. In it, he expressed sympathy for Indian demands for self-government, but observed presciently and with characteristic candour that the problem of how and by what stages you confer self-government upon scores of millions of people of races and religions, and with still a high percentage of illiteracy, is not a simple one. And bringing democracy to India was not simple. And arguably, it's never simple to bring democracy to any country. And yet, in the decades that have followed, India has defied expectations. Rather than succumbing to authoritarianism, as many other post-colonial nations would do, and as so many experts have predicted of India, India has emerged as one of the Third World's first enduring democracy, rooted not only in Western institutions, but in its own civilizational ethic of dharma, duty, order, and moral responsibility. So today, to unpack the history and contemporary nature of Indian democracy, I'm joined by Salvatore Babones, who's a sociologist, commentator, and author of a new book, Dharma Democracy: How India Built the Third World's First Democracy. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Salvatore.
It's great to talk to you.
It was great to have you on here, and you have written what I think can be fairly characterised as a provocative book. The current narrative of India's democracy is that it is a democracy in decline. It is lurching to authoritarianism, to rampant Hindu nationalism, that minority rights are being eroded. It is not a free society. But you take a very different approach and, of course, have written this fabulous book about the approach you've taken and the conclusions you draw. So, firstly, why a US sociologist living in Australia, in Sydney, why did you say to yourself 5 or 10 years ago, I'm going to write a book about Indian democracy?
Well, India is actually now labeled a quote-unquote electoral autocracy by the world's leading democracy rating authority, the Varieties of Democracy Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, funded by the European Union and a series of European foundations. But when I started this project, I didn't know that India was not a democracy. In fact, at the time, the leading academic democracy evaluating group was in the United States, the Center for Systemic Peace. They published the Polity Index. And on Polity, they still rate India a 9 on a scale from -10 to +10. In fact, Australia gets 10. The United States used to get an 8. They went a bit crazy at polity after Trump was elected, but that's a whole other story. So India was rated as among the world's best democracies. And that's all we knew as academics, was that India was among the world's best democracies. And so the puzzle for me was this classic quantitative political science problem. How did India remain a democracy when all other democracies of its type failed very quickly? India was expected to fail as a democracy, as you said in the intro, right away in the 1950s. It certainly shouldn't have lasted to today. When it had its big crisis in 1975-77, the emergency declared or engineered by Indira Gandhi, it should have failed then. And yet Indian democracy didn't fail, and it continues to thrive. So then one of the chief puzzles for the book, so the book ended up being about 2 puzzles. First, why is everyone saying that Indian democracy has failed when it seems to be a success? And then the second puzzle is, how did it continue to be such a success? And those 2 questions are really the basis for the book. And I'm looking forward to getting into them.
Yeah, it's interesting. You're a US citizen, and you've actually written a book on the new authoritarianism, Trump populism, and the tyranny of experts. So no doubt have your views on the diagnosis of US democracy.
Well, that was a self-indulgent book about my own country, but I'm primarily a comparative social scientist, and my expertise has been post-socialist transition economies of the middle-income tier of the world. So I've published books on the BRICS, on China-US relations, on Latin American indigeneity. I've done a lot of work on Russia and East Central Europe. I've published a whole series of articles early in my career. So my emphasis has typically been on the developing world, not on our developed democracies. And my original interest in India was part and parcel of that. India was a post-socialist transition economy that navigated the transition from socialism towards a market economy beginning in 1991. It had a later transition than China. It had a slower transition than China, with the result that India is still, instead of being 10 years behind China on the growth curve, it's 15 years behind China on the growth curve, but it's on the same trajectory as China. In fact, in other work, I've suggested that India will overtake China in GDP and GDP per capita by 2040 or so. We'll see how that pans out. But the book quickly became about Indian democracy because everyone was comfortable with the idea that India was going to grow rapidly. Everyone kept challenging me on questions about India's democracy. And for me, the key inflection point was when I wrote an article for Foreign Policy magazine about the 2020-2021 farm reforms in India. There were a series of 3 ordinances passed that I've analyzed from a technocratic perspective, saying that these were, good pro-market reforms for India's agriculture sector. The article was both admired by some, but also ruthlessly attacked, not because of anything about the technical arguments about farm reform, but because the question was, is it supporting Narendra Modi or is my article opposing Narendra Modi? And I was hit from both sides in India, which I guess is a good thing. And not just in India, by foreign experts as well. And that made me realize that the real question in India wasn't, is a reform good or bad? The real question was, do you like Narendra Modi or don't you like Narendra Modi? And that was driving everything.
And I guess, there's 2 aspects to your book which I think are really worth unpacking today. One is the diagnosis of India's democracy.
Yeah.
But the other is, how do we judge a democracy? And what you were just alluding to then really speaks to the kind of biases that are inbuilt into those who are charged with assessing whether a country is democratic or not. And I guess that was what I was trying to allude to before on the US, where it's falling down the scale is it because the people who are creating these scales of, whether you're more democratic or less democratic, they don't like Donald Trump, they don't like Giorgia Meloni, they don't like Viktor Orban,
Right.
They don't like Erdogan in Turkey, and they don't like Modi. They don't like their politics.
Right.
And therefore, then when it comes to saying, do they have free speech? Do they have journalistic freedom? Do they have free and fair elections? Are minority rights protected? All these things that we think are sort of fundamental to a democracy. They say, well, no, because of the leader, rather than looking at the actual facts and drawing sort of the comparative approach that you've taken. So before we get into the diagnosis of India, which of course is fundamental to today's discussion, can you tell me about these scales and audits of democracy that we sort of blindly rely on?
It's funny you should bring things back to the United States because the Center for Systemic Peace, as the name suggests, is a very progressive, people would say, quote unquote, left-oriented nonprofit organization in the United States. And in the new Trump administration, the 2020 the Trump 2 administration that started this year, they have downgraded the United States. They've said that Donald Trump engineered a presidential coup in the United States, and the United States is no longer a democracy at all. And in fact, they rate Russia, again, on the scale from -10 to +10, they rate Russia a 4 and the United States a 0. So that should give you some idea. They're saying that the US is worse than Russia under Vladimir Putin, which is just crazy, of course. But these are Americans evaluating America. When they evaluate the rest of the world, they're much calmer and more objective. Now, the same thing happens with on the other end of the scale, the Varieties of Democracy Institute rankings. Although they're produced in Sweden, they're actually produced based on a survey primarily of political scientists in the country being studied. And they're very committed to this. In fact, they say on their website that no more than 10% of their expert panelists reside in North America. They very much want to be a global perspective on democracy. But what that means is they're giving India's democracy rankings into the hands of Indians. And while that may sound very good, let people rate their own democracy, the fact is that Indian academics are very keenly opposed to Narendra Modi. And so when they evaluate India the same way the Center for Systemic Peace evaluates America. They evaluate it subjectively based on their own personal experiences instead of objectively looking at the data on their own country. It may sound very imperialist, but personally, I'd much more trust an external expert to look at a country than trust experts in the country itself making an evaluation of their own system. It's just too easy to be biased when looking at your own politics, especially when you yourself are a political scientist.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So Indian democracy, it becomes an independent country at the fall of the British Empire in the late 1940s. Robert Menzies in the early 40s is supposing it'll be difficult for them, given the very varied cultures and races and religions in that country and the concern over levels of illiteracy. And you've written about this being it's not a middle-class democracy like Australia is. Can you talk about the sort of the birth of Indian democracy and how it set itself up for success despite all the odds, despite Robert Menzies' concerns that it might not work?
Well, first, Robert Menzies used language that would be very typical, not only for his time, but for Westerners today, which is to say that Britain conferred self-governance on India. Of course, the Indian and the third world perspective on all of this would be that they demanded self-governance and were not going to accept anything less. And I think the historical record in India is that the British left India in a hurry. It was becoming ungovernable. And rather than pour enormous resources in attempting to stabilize the situation, the British pulled out. Not only that, they pulled out a year earlier than they had announced they would pull out. They were supposed to end the British rule in 1948, and they accelerated that to 1947 just to get out before the violence that was starting to permeate the country broke out in an even larger scale. So the British were chased out of India. They didn't confer self-governance on India, and I think that's just the historical reality. But they weren't chased out of India the way they were chased out of some African countries or some other Asian countries where the people who were chasing them out were some kind of, armed militia or armed rebel groups or insurgents or highly ideological people. India had a very strong, unified civil society. The challenge was that civil society was almost exclusively Hindu civil society in pre-independence India. Muslim civil society, such as it was very much an elite project and didn't permeate. The way Muslim leaders in India communicated with the broad Muslim population was via the imams and via the mosques. Whereas Hindu civil society was much more of a peer-to-peer shape. Now, that should come as no surprise when we study civil society. In fact, in Western countries, Western scholars of civil society generally exclude religious organizations by definition as part of civil society, because in the West, our religions are organized vertically. If you are a Presbyterian, you sit in a vertical Presbyterian silo and you don't attend a Catholic Mass. Catholics don't attend an Anglican Mass. That is, each religious community, and you could include Muslims in that. If you go to one mosque, you don't go. If you're a Sunni Muslim, you don't go to the Shia mosque. And if you're a Shia Muslim, you don't go to the Sunni mosque. These are separate silos. That's reflected even in our practice of having religious services. If you're Muslim, you go to Friday prayers. You can't go to Friday prayers at two different mosques because they're happening at the same time. If you're Christian or Jewish, you can't go to services because they're happening at the same time. In India, among Hindus, there's no such limitation. People can and do go to the Ram temple one day and go to the Shiva temple the next day, and go to the Ganesh and the Hanuman temple for different purposes. There's no inherent limitation. So India developed a civil society that very closely resembles the civil societies that supported democracies in the West, with one huge exception. India's civil society was overwhelmingly religious and Hindu in nature, and thus Western political scientists didn't see it. So the standard account in Western political science is rise of the middle class, leads to the rise of civil society, leads to democracy. So much so that Western political scientists have said categorically, no middle class, no democracy. You can't have it. Barrington Moore's famous formulation, no bourgeoisie, no democracy. Without the rise of the middle class, you can't have a democracy because you don't develop a civil society. Well, India developed a civil society and it was hidden from us because it was Hindu. Thus, the title of the book, Dharma Democracy. Dharma has two meanings. It both means duty, but it also has an implication of Hindu duty or dharmic duty, eternal duty, duty to whether it's Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, they would all use the word dharma as a specifically Indian idea of what duty means.
The criticisms of the decline of Indian democracy in recent years have been around this sort of Hindu nationalism of Narendra Modi and his BJP, that they're racist and exclusionary, that they use laws on sedition, defamation and counter-terrorism to silence their critics.
Sure.
I mean, do you see evidence that that is the case, or do you think that that is overstated?
Well, here's the funny thing. The supposed repression of Muslim Indians in no way enters quantitatively into the main democracy indices. That is, the indicators aren't there. The question's not there. Are there religious minorities who face persecution? So although the narrative has been Muslim Indians face persecution and thus India is not a democracy, that's not where the data come from. The data come from all sorts of allegations about press freedom, civil society, repression of civil society organizations, academic freedom, lack of free and fair elections, a lot of allegations that simply aren't true. And in the book, I spent a lot of time trying to show quantitatively that if we go to objective criteria, these simply aren't true. That said, there is a serious problem of Muslim social exclusion in India. And I can use the example of the United States in the 1950s. Nobody would say that 1955 America under Dwight D. Eisenhower was not a democracy. Of course it was a democracy. It was a democracy that had serious persecution and social exclusion of African Americans. It was a racist democracy. Now,
and you could say the same of Australia. It excluded.
And you could say the same for Indigenous people in very remote areas suffer serious discrimination or serious disadvantage, certainly, not necessarily discrimination. The Indian democracy, compared to that, is actually of much higher quality, which is to say that Muslim Indians suffer no legal impediments. They have full civil rights. They have full voting rights. There's no problems along those lines. Economically, they're of a similar profile to Hindu Indians, so there's no major income disadvantage. The only real problem India faces is one of social exclusion. That is to say, Muslims, frankly, are not part of the national mainstream in India. Whether you look at news media channels, if you look at parliamentary seats, if you look at the officer corps in the military, if you look at civil servants, if you look at university professors, that is, wherever you look in the professions, you see a lack of Muslim names. And the reason for that is simple. Most Muslim professionals left India for Pakistan in 1947, and a new Muslim intellectual class has not yet arisen. Now, it's been 80 years. It's time for that to dissipate. But generations happen. I mean, as you will personally recognize, people in the politics and information business have children go into the politics and information businesses. People who in the academia have children who go into academia. My own story is very rare. My father sold cigarettes on Broadway and I became a university professor. That doesn't happen very often. There's no legal impediment. It just doesn't happen. Muslim Indians have not yet been fully integrated into India's civil society, certainly not at the highest levels. That's the main impediment. But it's a problem of Indian nationhood, not a problem of Indian democracy.
When India's democracy was being established and the institutions of government were being established in the late 1940s, what was the intention of of Nehru and others? Was it to model British democracy, but for an Indian context? Or, I mean, was there a sort of a sense that, I mean, Nehru was British educated. He was an Anglophile in many respects, despite obviously suffering at the hands of the Raj.
A British barrister, absolutely, as were many of the figures.
Yeah, yes. And he was obviously of the elite. But according to the notes I have in front of me, he was imposing restrictions on free speech. He wasn't exactly living and breathing democracy or democratic principles at the very beginning, despite obviously being himself the victim of deprivation of democratic rights in the lead up to Indian independence.
Yeah, Jawaharlal Nehru is not among the most influential figures in the development of the Indian Constitution. He was in the Constituent Assembly and he was vociferous in it, but he was more involved in the day-to-day politics of dealing with the British administration. The draft Constitution was written by B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar is a Dalit hero, someone who rose up from quote-unquote untouchable status to become a Columbia University law graduate. He actually got his law degree in the U.S. He was not a British barrister like so many of the other Indian leaders. And he wrote the Indian Constitution with a lot of inspiration from the US Constitution, including a Bill of Rights, if you will, that guaranteed absolute freedom of speech and freedom of the press in India. Nehru, as soon as India became independent, he became prime minister. Before even holding an election, Nehru amended the Constitution to limit freedom of speech and freedom of the press and give the government the power to censor. Now, that's crazy, but that reflects their differences in perspective of a very American, freedom-loving sort of spirit in Ambedkar and Nehru's much more control-oriented approach. And Nehru governed, and I've said this, I may be a little harsh on Nehru, but he governed as the archetype of the third world dictator, which is to say, he limited freedom of speech and freedom of the press. He passed a law saying that he could nationalize private property. He then went ahead and nationalized all the key industries in India. He ran the country until he died. He never recruited a next generation of leaders to take over from him. He literally died in office. And who succeeded him after a brief interregnum? His daughter, Indira Gandhi, who he had set up to be the next leader, took the reins of power and governed for another 15 years, thus establishing what we call the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty. Gandhi, no relation to Mahatma Gandhi. Her husband was named Gandhi, Feroz Gandhi, an Indian freedom fighter, unrelated to the Mahatma. So, Nehru set this archetype that when you get independence, you set up your family party to run the country forever. And that archetype has rippled through South Asia, through Africa, through Southeast Asia. It has been very difficult to shake. India has shaken it off, but even today, the main opposition party is Indian National Congress, run by who? Run by Rahul Gandhi, great-grandson of Jawaharlal Nehru. The great irony is that in the West, it's the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty who are generally viewed as the great heroes of Indian democracy and liberalism, even though they're the socialists who repressed freedom of speech and nationalized industries. They have successfully portrayed themselves and been portrayed in the West as the good guys, if to use a simple word. And Narendra Modi and the BJP that he runs, who've long been the main ideological opposition to Congress, as the baddies, for lack of a better word.
Before we get on to the emergency, which I think is really important, obviously, moment in Indian democracy, I'd like to talk about partition and why it was necessary and how it shaped India's democracy and India's politics.
Yeah, Indians don't like when I say this, but the one person who did more to accelerate the independence of India was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who became the first president of Pakistan, the leader of the Muslim League. He forced the British out because he brought Muslim Indians into the streets. He declared Direct Action Day a year before the actual independence of India, encouraging, some would say, stoking violence among Muslim mobs who ran through the streets of Calcutta, then Calcutta. Now, Kolkata was the kind of epicenter of this, but also there were villages in what's now Bangladesh where Hindus were massacred by their Muslim neighbors. This, of course, provoked reactions. In Bihar, there was a massacre of Muslims by their Hindu neighbors. And this turn to violence was very clearly stoked by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who, although he did not say it, endorsed the phrase, India will be divided or India will be destroyed. And that was the slogan of Direct Action Day. So demands for a Muslim homeland drove the independence of India and drove the partition of India. Now, Jinnah was apparently very upset when Jawaharlal Nehru announced India's independence on August 15th, 1947, and he used the word India because it made the implication that Pakistan had gained independence from India when, in fact, it was a division, and Jinnah had assumed that India would be called Hindustan to be the complement to his Pakistan. Of course, it didn't happen. Nehru promoted the idea that India was the continuation of the British institutions in the subcontinent, and we have the history we had. But it set up the main fault lines that continue to plague Indian nationhood today. Because, of course, if Pakistan is necessary as a homeland for Muslim Indians, why are there 200 million Muslims in India?
And then, as Jenna was suggesting, is India really a Hindu state? I mean,
India's always insisted that it's a secular state. And look, to the credit of Narendra Modi and the BJP, they insist they're a secular party. Now, no one believes it. They govern entirely from a Hindu point of view, and they very much look to unify Hindu voters behind them. But that said, the only thing that I can find that Narendra Modi has ever done that might be considered to transgress the boundary between a secular state and a religious society is his participation in the consecration of the Ram Mandir, the temple to Lord Rama in Ayodhya, which was built on, there was a mosque built over a temple, and then a Hindu mob destroyed the mosque, and then eventually a Hindu temple was built on top of the site, and the mosque was relocated. And he played an official role breathing life into the murti and into the idol at the temple. And I think that clearly transgressed the boundaries between a secular state. A serving prime minister should attend the ceremony, but that the serving prime minister should play a religious role in the ceremony does strike me as inappropriate in a secular state. That said, India does not have Hindu national holidays. Australia has Christmas and Easter Monday. Is Australia a secular state? Australia has Sunday penalty wages because Christians go to church on Sunday. Is Australia a secular state? So this one transgression, although I do cover it in detail in the book, in the context of what Western countries do while remaining secular, it's not maybe such a big deal.
You talk about the difference between pluralism and tolerance, that the BJP is a tolerant party, but it's not a pluralistic party. Can you explain how that works in a democracy?
So some Westerners will have heard of Swami Vivekananda. He was the first major Hindu Swami to make an impact in the West. And even today, you can go to the Vedanta societies around Western cities, including in Sydney and Melbourne, and you can get books about Hindu faith from them. Swami Vivekananda is a hero in India, and he's a hero of Indian nationalism. He died very young in the early 1900s of tuberculosis in his 40s, but he left a message of piece that is best summed up by one of my chapter headings, which is taken directly from him, which is not only toleration. The toleration is not enough. What you have to have is sympathy, to be able to put yourself in the shoes of your neighbor and to understand your neighbor's perspective. Now, what India has is a lack of that sympathy. The BJP is very happy. I mean, again, legally, rhetorically, they're an entirely secular party. In practice, they're very happy for Muslims to do their own thing and be Muslims over there, right? Not as part of their bit of society. They don't want to persecute Muslims, but at the same time, they're not doing any favors for Muslims. And they hide that in the rhetoric of all citizens are citizens without regard to religion. And that's, technically correct. And you can't technically fault them for not willing to have any special consideration for anyone on behalf of that person's religion. That said, the reality is that Muslim Indians are a socially excluded minority in India. And if no effort is made, then they'll remain a socially excluded minority in India. And Australians might think of this the same way we think of questions around indigeneity. One group in society will say a citizen's a citizen and there should be no special laws for any citizens in society. But another answer to that is, if you do nothing about it, there will be terrible remote indigenous poverty forever, right? So you have to do something special for it. And this is an enduring question of democracy. So although I think that Narendra Modi and the BJP have come to the uncharitable answer in not reaching out more to Muslim voters, and although I think that they are defeating themselves and that I think electorally they would do better if they did more outreach, this is not a problem for Indian democracy. It's a challenge for India's nation and how united or divided it might be.
The emergency happened at the end of this, was it the Nehru-Gandhi years that you write about in 75 to 77. Yeah, 75 to 77 when Indira Gandhi suspended elections. She imprisoned opponents and ruled by decree. And there's
imprisoned over 100,000 people, not just a few opponents. Yeah.
One of my favourite books is A Fine Balance by Rohinton Mistry, which is about this period. So it was a bloody and violent time and enormous amount of repression. Obviously, the nadir of Indian democracy. So how does India come back from that?
First of all, I want to stress, India was ruled constitutionally during the emergency. Indira Gandhi used constitutional means to declare it. She may have pushed the limits of the law in some cases, but leaders in all democracies occasionally push the limits of the law. The detentions were made lawfully. So this wasn't sending the army out. The army played no role in the emergency. Indira Gandhi, in fact, the story goes that she asked for the army simply to provide water, logistical support for one of her rallies, and the army refused. They said, we don't do politics. Even to the point of, we won't bring water trucks from the army to help you hold a rally so that people can drink something. So the emergency was a constitutional process in India, allowed under India's constitution, much as today, for example, there's an emergency in Ukraine and Ukrainian elections have been suspended because it's the Ukrainian constitution allows for that. Whether it's right or wrong, I think clearly it's wrong, and most people will disagree with it. But it was legal and orderly. And that's something I really want to stress. Most importantly, when the emergency was over and she returned India to ordinary constitutional rule, she held elections. The opposition leaders who were in prison during the emergency were allowed to contest, were released and allowed to contest the elections. And they won. Not only that, she lost her own seat. And instead of trying to grasp and stay in power and annul the elections, there was none of that. She left office gracefully and returned several years later to become prime minister again, because she was not penalized by the voters for taking away, their right to have an election, right? She held the election, she followed democratic procedures, and she later returned to power. So that's a story that you won't hear, I think, in virtually any other developing country, of a virtual dictator seizing emergency powers, holding an election, and letting the opposition win. That's just, but that's distinctly Indian. And in the book, I trace that to the fact that India, unlike most developing countries, had a very strong, united civil society that was able, despite 120,000 of its leaders being in jail, civil society continued to operate.
Because they were all Hindu.
Because it's a horizontal network. Yeah. Because people knew people were connected with people. Now, it's very different in a country where most organizations are hierarchical and vertical. Then you take the 100,000 leaders and put them in jail, and each of the people are in separate silos and they're not connected to each other. In a Nazi Germany, the Lutheran church is not connected to the Catholic church next door to it. And so you take all the leadership, and Nazis did put their own people in charge of the Lutheran church, and it's very difficult for people to connect because they don't have those person-to-person connections through the religious sphere. In India, people had those person-to-person connections. They organized and they fought the election, despite the enormous handicap of having been repressed for 22 months. They still were able to fight the election and win it.
I mean, Indian governments do change hands over history, but they do also have the occasion of this sort of dominant party state as well. And you see this in Japan, for example. Yeah. Since the Second World War, Japan's almost always been ruled by the Liberal Democratic Party. Same in Singapore, the PAP. Yeah. I mean, the ACT here in Australia is said to be a dominant party state since, I think, 2001. It's only been run by Labor and the Greens. The
Republicans don't win in Chicago.
Yeah. I mean, how does this affect democracy in India?
The difference in India is that the dominant party has changed. The dominant party is always vulnerable. Even the BJP, for all its electoral dominance, only won 32.5% of the vote at the last election. So this is
sounds a bit familiar.
Yeah, Labour in Australia or the UK. But the point is, it's not as dominant as it seems because it's not winning 60, 70% of the vote. It's not even winning huge majorities in parliament. It's having to fight for every single seat. I mean, right now in India, there are allegations coming from the Indian National Congress leader, Rahul Gandhi, that there was massive vote fraud in the 2024 election. We'll find out what his evidence is and if it's true. But he's not alleging that there was vote fraud throughout the country. He's saying that, well, if you could even swing 10 seats, you could have a massive difference. And I think that's indicative that whether or not there was vote fraud, I don't know. I'll reserve judgment until I see the evidence. But it's true that in India, just swinging a few seats either way will determine the outcome. So it's not nearly as dominant party as Japan, never mind Singapore. The opposition has a realistic opportunity at every election to change its government. And that includes today, the 2024 election. There was an opposition coalition that, if it had held together, if it had been united, would have unseated Narendra Modi. It was not united, and it disintegrated very quickly. If there is a opposition coalition in 2029 that holds together, that offers a compelling alternative vision for India, they have every chance to win the election.
Your book is titled Dharma Democracy. Dharma is obviously not an English word. I said in my introduction it means duty, but I understand it's a little hard to translate directly into English. But can you tell us what you mean by Dharma democracy? I mean, it's the quintessential Indian democracy that... Dharma is simply the Sanskrit word for duty, and I take that on the authority of one of the greatest Hindu scholars in history, Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, second president of India, and the Oxford professor of Eastern religions, as it happens. A straight quote from him, Dharma means duty. It's that simple. It is, however, a Sanskrit and Hindu suffused word for duty. It's not the English word for duty, and thus it has different implications. Now, I call the book Dharma Democracy both because India is a democracy of duties. I'm going to quote from the back cover of the book from Sri Aurobindo, again, another major Hindu scholar. Dharma is the basis of democracy which Asia must recognize, for in this lies the distinction between the soul of Asia and the soul of Europe. And he wrote a famous essay called Asiatic Democracy, in which he assessed the prospects for democracy this was before World War II, assessed prospects for democracy in Japan, India, and China. His argument, and this I'm very sympathetic to this, is that the narrative of freedoms and rights that so inspires us in the West is not necessarily an inspiring narrative for the East or for non-Western countries, for highly traditional countries. That narrative only became really inspiring for people in the West once people in the West had ceased to strongly hold to religious beliefs. Once religious practice had declined. And it's no coincidence that in the French Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man occurred in an era of suppression of the Catholic Church or rebellion against the Catholic Church. The United States Bill of Rights occurred in an era of what we often call deism, that is, of people having a spiritual connection to God, but not necessarily being observant religiously. These narratives of rights work very well in modern societies where people maybe don't center their entire life around religion. However, in a life where you have a strong, non-religious civil society. And is it also in a society that values the individual over the whole, do you think? This sort of sense of community in Indian society seems to be much stronger, and that's the sense of the shared sense of Indian identity.
Exactly. So I wouldn't say that they don't value the individual, but they do value society more. There's more of an attachment to traditional social identities rather than individual identities. Now, that's not to say that India doesn't have individual rights. Indian Constitution guarantees individual rights, and Indians do have individual rights. But there's also a Charter of Duties in the Indian Constitution. The only other place where you'll find charters of duties are in the former Soviet republics and in communist countries where the Charter of Duties is used to override civil rights. In India, that's not the case. The Charter of Duties is aspirational. It says that you have a duty to the country, a duty to mankind, a duty to advancement of the human race, a duty to education, right? It's meant to be inspiring to people. and to motivate people.
Are they enforceable? I mean, if you...
No, they're not enforceable.
Because there's one, I think in 2002, the government added a duty for parents to provide opportunities for education for their children.
Yes,
Robert Menzies would have liked that.
But they're entirely aspirational.
So if you're a child and your parents don't provide opportunities for education to you, can you go to court and challenge them?
They're not actionable. I'm not an Indian constitutional lawyer, but my understanding is they're not actionable.
Right.
That said, they are aspirational.
So it's like almost a preamble. It's a lovely sort of set of principles, but doesn't actually have any legal effect.
But it also forms the rhetoric of democracy, which is to say, if you're trying to inspire, as we have in recent years in the West, if you're trying to inspire poor, highly religious, highly traditional people in Afghanistan or Iraq or the Palestinian territories to embrace democracy, what do you inspire them with? Now, I firmly believe in things like women's equality, in gay rights, in minority rights. These are not things that will inspire a traditional Sunni Muslim in Afghanistan to want democracy. They're part of democracy. They have to be there. But the inspiring thing is to say, you have a duty to protect your family. You have a duty to educate your daughters. You have a duty to ensure that your neighbors aren't harmed by people from outside the community. That is, this idea of duties is something that is much more likely to inspire in traditional societies than the narrative of rights. You need rights to have a democracy. Let's not quibble over that. That's absolutely the case. And India has those rights. But that's not what people talk about when they talk about democracy. And we Americans are always talking about freedom of speech when we talk about democracy. That's not the narrative in India. The narrative in India is much more about duty to the nation.
It seems to me that the critique of Indian democracy is that it's democracy for the Hindu Indian, but not democracy for the Muslim Indian.
There's some truth in that.
This idea of Dharma and the Charter of Duties, I mean, if you're a Muslim Indian, do these speak to you? Did these inspire you, as you were saying?
That is the challenge. There is some truth in that, and that's a major theme of the book, that Muslim Indians suffer severe social exclusion. For example, there's enormous residential segregation in India. Something like way off the scale of anything you would see in a major US city where there are Black neighborhoods and white neighborhoods and Hispanic neighborhoods. In India, it's almost total, that there are areas where Muslims live and areas where Hindus live, and never the twain shall meet. Now, that's not healthy for democracy. It's not something that fosters a unified sense of nationhood. And in fact, some of the most repulsive rhetoric in India comes with this sort of anti-Muslim rhetoric, quote unquote, go home to Pakistan. Now, of course, Muslim Indians can't go home to Pakistan. Their home is India. You can understand where the rhetoric comes from, but that doesn't make it any more palatable. Now, this is a serious problem for Indian democracy because it means that the Muslim vote, quote unquote, becomes a vote of protection. That is, Muslims will vote en bloc for a party that promises to protect Muslim rights and privileges in India, instead of Muslims voting as ordinary citizens. That is, I want this party because it's preferring home ownership, or I want this party because it has the environmental policy I prefer. They're voting as a bloc as Muslims. Now, Hindus do not vote as a bloc as Hindus. The BJP has worked to break down the various Hindu voting blocs, which have mainly been by caste or by minority language group or by tribe, scheduled tribe. These voting blocs are slowly disintegrating in India, but the Muslim voting bloc remains. It is the Muslim vote. It generally goes to the Indian National Congress, although in certain states, for instance, in Bihar, the second largest state in India, the Muslim vote has actually allied more often with a Dalit or scheduled caste vote. And so a party dominated by a particular scheduled caste, or Yadavs in Bihar, have been joined by Muslims in a single voting bloc. And I apologize, Yadavs, they're not actually scheduled caste in Bihar. I believe they're considered an other backwards class in Bihar. But in any case, a less privileged caste in Bihar. So the Muslim vote is a floating vote that depends on what alliance it seeks, but it is a separate vote. And that's really the problem for India's unity. It's separate.
And I mean, in the
separate.
Australian context, we haven't had religious parties. I mean, occasionally we had Family First, which was ostensibly a Christian party. There was the Muslim vote.
There was an attempt to create a Muslim party.
It was an attempt, but it seemed to be a bit of a damp squib in the end. And it didn't
but the same thing happens in India that happens here. Of like, here in the Muslim outer suburbs, there are instructions given in mosques on how to vote at election time. But there's a lot of evidence that, many Muslims don't follow those instructions. There's division. Now, the division is not entirely, liberals get very few Muslim votes in Australia. But do those votes go to Labour, or do they go to the Greens, or do they go to a new party? There's not the same kind of absolute block there is in most elections in India. What's more important is those Muslim voters in Australia are not voting for, quote unquote, protection. Right, they're not voting to have their interests protected, and so offering it up to the highest bidder, so to speak.
No, I mean they tend to vote on a foreign policy issue, and the party that is
today they're voting on Palestine issues, but it's not as united a bloc as in
India. And our recent election would indicate that it isn't.
And more importantly, liberals in Australia would like nothing more than to attract 20 or 30% of the Muslim vote. The only thing they'd like more is to attract 50% of the Muslim 100%. Vote. In India, the BJP is not making the attempt.
But I guess my question is, so in Australia, the phenomenon of religiously aligned political parties concern people. I thought that's not a positive trajectory for our democracy. We want an element of social cohesion in Australia so that people don't focus on religious differences. We focus on, the direction the country's going in, the economy, the environment, and the social welfare system, social justice issues, and the like, productivity, AI these days. But India has these systemic problems. Yet you say its democracy is well functioning. It is a successful democracy. It shouldn't be, way down the list of functioning democracies that the analysts say it is. So tell me, for Australia, for what are supposed to be successful liberal democratic countries of the West, what are the lessons we can learn from Dharma democracy, the Indian democracy?
There are two things we can learn. First, we can learn simply that having pride in your country, having a sense of duty to your nation, is not such a bad thing. We are a bit ashamed, especially in Australia. From an American perspective, Australians show an incredible shame about patriotism. In India, there's no shame. Not just the BJP. People think the BJP is highly nationalist. Go watch some Indian National Congress propaganda or some other opposition party propaganda. They're complaining that the BJP is not patriotic enough. It's crazy. The accusations being made against Narendra Modi in Parliament with relation to Operation Sindoor, which was the reprisal attacks on terrorist camps in Pakistan from the Pahalgam terrorist attacks that Pakistan orchestrated in India in May. So the complaint is not that Narendra Modi is being jingoistic, that he's using the military to try to win elections, that he's too nationalistic. The complaint is that he hasn't been aggressive enough.
Yeah.
Right. So
it's hard to imagine in the Australian context, as you say.
It's hard to imagine. But so everyone in India, the degree of overt, wear it on your sleeves patriotism in India is extreme. And it works. It keeps people together. It keeps people feeling that they're all part of the same nation, the same country, the same community. But the other and more important thing I think that we can learn is how to do democracy abroad. We keep thinking we can export our democracies to Papua New Guinea, that we can export our democracies to East Timor, to sub-Saharan African countries, to the Middle East, most of all. Indian democracy is a much better candidate for being exported to poor developing countries where people are highly religious. And if we wanted to learn the lesson from India, it's that the first thing that should be done in promoting democracy is not focusing on individual rights. Those are important. You have to have them. But if we want democracy to be lasting, the important thing is to focus on the development of strong attachments, connections to civil society, to have people feel like they are part of a national community. I'm going to, again, paraphrase Barrington Moore. Instead of no bourgeoisie, no democracy, I would say no nation, no democracy. If a country can't hold together and all feel that they're on the same team, you can't run a democracy. India has succeeded in uniting across more than 20 languages, caste divisions, religious divisions, geographic divisions. India's succeeded in creating a sense of nationhood. And that's what's missing in much of the third world, much of the developing world. That has to come first.
And I think that is such a fundamental part of their education system, the limited amount I know about it, but they're imbued with that sense of history, of where they've come from and how they're all united together and what they've built. And I mean, it's so very important.
Well,
for that
there are history wars in India, just as there are history wars in every country. But the war tends to be over how patriotic can you be, and how much can you love your own country? And again, it may sound, a bit déclassé from a Western intellectual standpoint, but that's because we already have that. Australia has no shortage of Australian pride to kind of coast on or to draw down its Australian pride account in attacks on its own history. Developing countries have to develop that pride first. They don't have it. There was no such country as Nigeria before Nigeria became independent. There was no such country as Bangladesh before Bangladesh became independent. Cambodia, these places did not exist as countries. And you have to have a sense that you're a unified national community before you can have a democracy, because otherwise at the first election, whichever tribe wins the biggest vote, they're never going to hold an election again. And that has happened in country after country. It has not happened in India.
Salvatore Babones, thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light. This has been a really fascinating exploration of Indian democracy from 1947 to today and all that happened in the middle. And I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts and insights with our audience. Thank you.
Great to talk to you. Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.